So August 1st is going to come. We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. We have the confines of a deal with China, but we haven't really, we don't have a deal with Canada.
It's the middle of summer, but the temperature between the United States and Canada has never been colder. Just days ago, President Trump signaled something few expected to hear. The US may no longer be interested in reaching a new trade agreement with Canada. Instead, he hinted that tariffs alone might do the job. The message was simple: Washington is done waiting. As he boarded Air Force One for a trip to Scotland, Trump's decision marked a turning point. With the self-imposed August 1st deadline fast approaching, the United States is preparing to hit Canadian goods with a 35% tariff unless a new deal is signed. But on the other side of the border, Canada isn't blinking. Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team made their stance clear. Canada will not sign a bad deal, no matter the pressure. At the heart of the current standoff is a paradox. The Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA, is still in force. Under this agreement, over 90% of Canadian exports to the US face zero tariffs, assuming they comply with rules of origin. But the reality on the ground is shifting. Section 2, 32 tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and auto parts remain in place with some rates as high as 50%. And now, with the threat of an across-the-board 35% tariff, Canada faces a second layer of economic pressure that exists outside the CUSMA framework. These measures have had a chilling effect on Canadian industries and raised questions about whether the US is still honoring the spirit of its trade commitments.
I think the president is trying to up a little pressure on Canada. We saw this in the case of Japan as well. So I think he's still posturing a little bit, trying to create an environment where Canada might be willing to give up a little bit more.
This isn't the first time Trump has used tariffs as leverage, but this time, Canada isn't giving in. The Prime Minister's position is supported by provincial premiers and trade officials. Their consensus: a rushed deal made to avoid a tariff deadline is more dangerous than no deal at all. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc echoed this view after high-level meetings in Washington, emphasizing that any agreement must deliver long-term stability for Canadian workers. Meanwhile, Carney continues to resist short-term pressure tactics, arguing that Canada needs structural guarantees, not just temporary relief.
So Canadian companies that sell things to the United States, almost 30% of them are now redirecting to other countries, so they're starting to diversify who they trade with.
The political battle is spilling over into the economy. According to a July 2025 report by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, nearly 30% of Canadian exporters have already begun shifting trade away from the US, and 37% of companies say they are now sourcing components and inputs from non-US suppliers. This isn't just a short-term pivot. For many firms, it reflects a deeper shift in trust. After decades of economic integration, Canadian businesses are hedging their bets, diversifying markets, reducing reliance on American buyers, and building more resilient supply chains. And that may eventually cost the US too, because when Canada rewires its trade model, America loses not just a customer, but a partner. So why isn't Canada racing to sign something before August 1st? The answer lies beyond the headlines. In 2026, CUSMA faces a mandatory joint review, an opportunity to revise, restructure, or even renegotiate the entire agreement. For Carney, that review is the real battleground. And to enter it from a position of strength, Canada cannot afford to settle now. Sources close to Ottawa suggest the government is preparing a broader economic security framework for future negotiations, one that ties defense cooperation, Arctic sovereignty, and clean energy into the trade equation. In that context, a quick fix with Trump could weaken Canada's position in a much larger game. The August 1st deadline is looming, but no agreement is in sight. The United States is preparing to raise tariffs. Canada is preparing to absorb the blow. What we're witnessing isn't just a tough phase in a long relationship. It may be the beginning of a fundamental shift. Trump is demanding results now. Carney is planning for what comes next. And the space between those two strategies? That's where the future of North American trade is being rewritten.
Overseas now, and the European Union thought it had a trade deal with the US. That's until further concessions were requested from the White House last week.
Just weeks ago, the United States and the European Union were closing in on a deal. After months of back and forth, both sides had converged around a 10% tariff ceiling, a modest but significant breakthrough. Then came the reversal. President Trump raised the ask. First 15%, then 30%. It wasn't a counteroffer, it was a reset. Suddenly, the finish line moved out of reach, and the EU saw it not as negotiation but coercion. What had been a pathway to de-escalation became a roadblock to agreement. In response, the European Commission began assembling one of its largest retaliation packages in decades. According to Politico and the Wall Street Journal, the bloc is preparing up to 72 billion euros in counter-tariffs. Targets include luxury American goods, beef, soybeans, cars, aircraft parts, and cloud computing infrastructure, industries that cut deep into politically sensitive regions of the US. Beyond tariffs, the EU is poised to use its anti-coercion instrument, enabling non-tariff penalties, restricting American firms from public contracts, reviewing cross-border investments, and suspending shared technical certifications. The retaliation is not just economic, it's legal, systemic, and meant to deter future strong-arming.
We are facing the most significant crisis of our lifetimes because of President Trump's unjustified tariffs and his threats.
Up north, Canada is mobilizing too. In Muskoka, Prime Minister Mark Carney has gathered all provincial premiers for an emergency summit, an extraordinary move that underscores the severity of the threat. There are two tracks. First, to pursue a narrow, sector-specific deal before the August 1st deadline. Second, to brace for the fallout if Trump moves ahead with his 35% tariff threat on goods outside USMCA protection. Unlike the EU, Canada has already acted. Ottawa imposed a 25% tariff on American automobiles. Domestic trade barriers between provinces are being torn down, and exports to the US have dropped from 78% to 68% in the past year, as Canada diversifies toward Europe and Asia.
Well, the US-EU trading relationship is one of the largest in the world, and we depend on each other for a myriad of goods and services, many of which are critical sectors for the United States.
Does Canada have any cards to play here?
A lot of Americans make their living by selling goods to Canadians and services to Canadians.
Together, the EU and Canada account for a massive portion of US trade. In 2024, the EU was America's second-largest export market, worth over $360 billion, according to the US Census Bureau. Canada was number one, absorbing more than $390 billion in US goods. These aren't one-sided dependencies. The US relies on Canada for critical minerals, uranium, and energy, inputs that power everything from AI data centers to defense systems. Europe, meanwhile, supplies key components, pharmaceuticals, and industrial equipment that underpin American manufacturing. Trump's tariffs might force short-term concessions, but in the long run, they risk destabilizing deeply intertwined supply chains and weakening strategic alliances that took decades to build. Markets are beginning to show strain. Bloomberg reports that U.S. import container volumes have declined for 2 straight months, one of the sharpest year-over-year drops on record. The Yale Budget Lab confirms that U.S. tariff rates are now at their highest levels since 1910. The fallout is no longer theoretical. It's material, measurable, and spreading. On the surface, Trump appears to control the game. He sets the tempo, he defines the rules, and he decides when or if the deal gets signed. But control isn't just about declarations, it's about consequences. If Canada and the EU move forward with coordinated retaliation, the damage won't stay overseas. It will reach US ports, farms, factories, and storefronts. American consumers will face higher prices. Small businesses will feel the squeeze. And allies will begin to question the reliability of US leadership. Trump may believe he holds the upper hand, but if Europe and Canada strike back together, this won't be a negotiation. It'll be a reckoning.
With the trade war between Canada and the United States causing economic uncertainty, Canadian leaders are looking to Asia and Europe for reliable trade partners.
European negotiators say trade between the U.S. and EU could be effectively cut off if Trump goes ahead with a 30% tariff that he threatened over the weekend.
America's global influence was built not just on military power, but on long-standing partnerships, especially in trade. Today, that foundation is starting to break. If President Trump continues to raise tariffs on key allies, the United States risks more than short-term retaliation. It could lose its central role in the global economy. Canada is shifting its trade strategy. The European Union is preparing to strike back. And together, these moves are showing that the world may be ready to move on without U.S. leadership.
The deals are made. There are no deals to make. They would like to do a different kind of a deal, and we're always open to talk. We are open to talk, including to Europe. In fact, they're coming over, they'd like to talk.
President Trump believes that high tariffs will force other countries to accept better trade terms. But if those countries decide to stop relying on the U.S. altogether, the result could be long-term damage. When global supply chains adjust, the changes are not easily reversed. Companies may move production away from North America. Trade flows may shift permanently. Key U.S. industries, like finance, pharmaceuticals, and technology, could face new restrictions and rising costs in foreign markets. And once trading partners begin to rely less on U.S. systems, including the dollar and American tech platforms, the U.S. risks being left out of decisions that shape the global economy. The European Union is treating Trump's tariffs not just as an economic threat, but as a strategic rupture. Officials in Brussels say a 30% tariff on EU goods could effectively wipe out transatlantic trade. According to the European Commission, the U.S. imports more than $600 billion annually from the EU, while exporting only $370 billion. At first, the EU held back, pausing a $25 billion countermeasure package to allow for dialogue. But they've already prepared a larger $72 billion retaliation if talks collapse. Their strategy is twofold: de-escalate if possible, but punish if necessary. What's notable isn't just the scope of the response. It's the areas being targeted, U.S. services like finance and tech, where retaliation would hurt most.
Last month, you look at the data from Statistics Canada, which looks at the month of May, and we saw the highest amount of merchandise exports to non-U.S. countries since at least 2021.
Canada's response has been quieter, but no less consequential. After Trump's tariff announcement, exports to the U.S. dropped sharply. In May 2025, Statistics Canada reported just $41 billion in exports to the U.S., a 25% decline from January. Meanwhile, exports to non-U.S. countries rose to $19 billion, the highest since 2021. Canada is redirecting gold to the UK, oil to Singapore, pharmaceuticals to Italy. More than that, Canada is reopening dialogue with India, despite political tension. For Alberta and Saskatchewan, accessing India's pulse crop market is critical. This isn't just diversification, it's a structural shift. Prime Minister Mark Carney isn't threatening countermeasures. He's methodically building an economy that no longer depends on the U.S., a move supported by both policy and public sentiment. Trump's strategy is clear. He believes pressure forces deals. But pressure without flexibility can create fractures. The EU isn't folding, Canada isn't waiting. And if Trump continues down this path, America may win a few concessions, but lose the cohesion that once made it powerful. In trying to maximize leverage, Washington could undermine its own role in global leadership. Allies won't leave in anger. They'll simply move on, with new partners, new trade routes, and a future that no longer revolves around the U.S. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. Trump's tariff play may feel strong in the short term, but the long game is different. And as Canada restructures and Europe prepares its counterpunch, one reality grows clearer. The world won't wait for America to lead. Not if it keeps pushing them away.